The United States women's national team defeat Uzbekistan 9-1 in the first of two April friendlies. The kids are all right. 7 of the 9 United States goals were scored by players aged 25 or younger, with a hat trick coming from Sophia Smith in just her 14th appearance with the United States. Despite conceding the first goal at home in 2 years, a lot was learned in this first 90 minutes for the United States. We recapped this opening match, discussed what we learned, player combinations that stood out, positional pairings across the pitch, and changes we want to see in the second friendly versus Uzbekistan this Tuesday. Like this video and subscribe to the Attacking Third YouTube page right now and join in the conversation in the chat because we want to hear from you. Welcome into the United States Women's National Team Hour alongside former U.S. National Team midfielder Lori Lindsey. I am your host, Lisa Roman. You can join us live on YouTube at youtube.com/attacking-third. Join in the conversation in the YouTube chat. And you can listen to all of the U.S. Women's National Team Hour shows on the Attacking Third podcast. Download and follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, all the places that you are listening to your podcasts. On today's episode, we are recapping the U.S.'s dominant 9-1 victory over Uzbekistan. We're discussing the biggest things that we learned, and we're looking to head to match 2 for the USA versus Uzbekistan on Tuesday. Lori Lindsey, welcome in. How are you today?
Yeah, great, Lise. How's it going? Good to see you as always. And thanks for chiming in. And Steve, I'm already reading the comments, which is my favorite part. Steve, you rule as well. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, we love the comments. Everyone, drop your comments and your questions in the chat for us. The chat, we want it to be very active, and we also want you guys to win. We have a $100 Paramount Plus gift card to give away during today's episode. All you have to do is drop your Instagram or Twitter handle without the @ symbol. Don't include the @ sign in the chat, and you have a chance to win a $100 Paramount Plus subscription. You can watch Serie A, CONCACAF, Champions League, NWSL, all of it. So $100 Paramount Plus gift card. Drop your handle in the chat. But we have a lot to chat about today, Lori. I know that you're doing good. I'm doing good too. A busy weekend. We're right in the middle of these 2 April friendlies for the United States. They played on Saturday in Ohio, a 9-1 victory. I'm going to run through the starting lineup because that's what we did a lot of our predictions on. We had Alyssa Nair in goal, Kelly O'Hara, Abby Dahlkemper, Alana Cook, and Emily Fox across the back line. Andi, Sullivan, Lindsey Horan, and Rose Lavelle in the midfield. I want to talk about that midfield trio. Mallory Pugh, Katarina Macario, and Sophia Smith up front for Vlatko Andonovski in this opening match against Uzbekistan. 5 starters under the age of 25, and Alyssa Nair in goal, getting her 80th cap. Lori, when this starting lineup came out, when we saw the first 45 minutes with this, what were you thinking? What were your initial impressions of this crew and the first 45 minutes, really?
Yeah, not totally surprising. I mean, when I look back at what I had last week for the starting lineup in that first game that I won, at least, only 2 differences in that starting lineup. I had Huerta on the right back, but Kelly O'Hara obviously captaining the team for this game. And then I had actually Sanchez in there with Sullivan and Horan, but obviously we saw Rose and everybody else across the board. So, not much difference than what we kind of expected, especially in this first game, and kind of the patterns that we've seen from Vlatko when he rolls out a team that he kind of thinks is like, all right, this is the group that I feel like has been in best form with club coming into these international windows. And so, good performance. I think early on, everyone was like, are we going to get a goal? Is this going to be a little bit of some glimpses of what it looked like somewhat in the She Believes Cup? But, I will say naive. I thought Uzbekistan was going to sit back more than they did. And I almost thought they were playing this high line in a bit of in a naive way. But you know what? I totally support it. I mean, they don't care if I support them, I'm sure, but I do, in the fact that I think these teams are coming in now and playing the US in a way that's like, they're looking at it as, okay, we're not just going to sit back. How are we going to learn about ourselves, right? Yes, we might take a beating, especially when you look at the 3 that played for this U.S. team up top. But it played right into the hands of the U.S., obviously, with so much space in behind the back line. And as the game wore on, I mean, that just opened up, right? But credit to them. I think Uzbekistan, they came out, they fought hard. We knew that. but just left themselves exposed. I think outside of your question of what this looked like for 45, a really solid performance, right, from the U.S.
Right.
I'll be curious what the lineup looks like going into tomorrow's game, and also how, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more as we go on, but Uzbekistan sets up, because I'm not so sure with such a quick turnaround they're going to be able to not somewhat sit back, right? I think they're going to have to kind of adjust in between how they played on Saturday and how they play tomorrow.
I agree with you completely about how, I mean, we talked about it in the preview of this two friendlies in April for this US team, and really looking at Uzbekistan, we talked so much about a low block, and that's how we've seen teams play against the United States, because they just want to try to keep them out of their box. And we did not see that from Uzbekistan. And I think that almost surprised the United States, at least for the first 25 minutes or so, because it was almost like this is a different game plan than what we were maybe initially talking about heading into this, because a team that's playing a high line versus playing a low defensive block, that's a different game plan. It's different holes that you can pop into as players. But ultimately 9-1 in this match. We had goals from Andi, Sullivan, Mallory Pugh, Sophia Smith, Katarina Macario, Jealin, Howell, Ashley Hatch, and Ashley Sanchez. So Howell and Sanchez both getting their first senior team goals. 7 of these 9 goals were from players aged 25 and under. This was a lot. We saw so many good things, but I want to talk about those first 25 minutes, because we didn't get a first goal from the United States until 26 minutes in. Andi, Sullivan, and then after that opening goal in the 26 minutes, over the next 9 minutes, there was 4 goals scored by this U.S. team. Sophia Smith ultimately getting a hat trick, but 2 of those goals coming from her. Mallory Pugh notching another one all before halftime in that 9-minute span. When you looked at these first 25 minutes of this team, there were a few shots off the crossbar early on in this game, about 3 or so minutes in. What were you missing from this front line? Let's look at specifically. Was it getting time for them together on the pitch? Was it connecting with that midfield unit, or was it really just feeling out Uzbekistan in this first 25 minutes? I mean, if you break the first half into 2 halves, what do you see from the first half of that first half?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there was anything that's like was glaring, right? I think the thing that we have to remember is, again, this team and is young in terms of international team experience, right? So, or just international experience, and also there are World Cup qualifiers coming up, and these are the chances for these players to really make a statement. I mean, there's all this conversation around like these veteran players. So the first time in many years that there's been like quite a few wide open spots available. And so anytime you come in, well, there's a lot of these young players that are like hungry to score goals, to compete at this level and make a statement. And I think sometimes that's what you get into early on, is that people want to go, right? They want to go to goal. That is what the U.S. is about. We want to score goals. We want to score early. We want to score often. And sometimes, at the beginning of games, you're just trying to settle in. And there could have easily been some goals way earlier than we saw, and they just didn't fall the way that the U.S. wanted, or each individual player. So I think, and to your point a little bit ago as well, I think at first there was the Uzbekistan was pinned in a little bit from the U.S., so there wasn't as much space to occupy in behind as we saw when Uzbekistan was able to get out of their own box. Then we saw them step up and have a higher line, and that's when space opened up in behind. That obviously suits the U.S. in that front 3 that we saw of Smith, Pugh, and Macario really well. So, nothing alarming. I think this is a team that's just filling out games, coming in, don't play a ton of minutes together outside of what we saw in the She Believes Cup. So, and then the floodgates open, right? You get one.
Oh, yeah.
But what I did see is players that were fired up, right? And want to build confidence and got minutes in the She Believes, took that back with their club teams, have performed well with their individual teams, and then now have showed up and come in and they're like hungry and want to. And we're seeing a lot of players that are playing high level. I mean, that front line of Macario, Pugh, and Smith, we could just spend an hour talking about them and how dynamic they were, right? Like regardless of the team you're playing against, that is a potent front line, and it shouldn't be understated.
I want to talk about this front line. How can we not talk about it? We're not going to spend the whole hour diving in on these front three, but the front three that did earn the start in Sophia Smith, Mallory Pugh, and Katerina Macario. We had Macario in that central forward role. She wasn't really a false nine. She was playing a lot higher than we have seen her play in the She Believes Cup. She dropped back a lot more during the She Believes Cup, but now Macario in that first match for the U.S. was pressed really high. She almost played pretty similarly to how Ashley Hatch plays when she's in that role, stretching back lines. And when you have two players alongside of you in Pugh and Smith that are so quick and love to run at back lines and want to make those darting runs inside, check back and receive the ball at their feet, and they're so lethal whipping crosses into the box, it's interesting that Macario did play so high, which actually opened up so much space in the midfield for Rose Lavelle, Lindsey Horan, and Andi Sullivan. But when you look at this front three, this is a front three that you wanted to start in when you look at these matches. So maybe Vlatko Andonovski is listening to our U.S. Women's National Team Hour.
He better be.
Hey,
I mean, come on.
Hey, Vlatko, how's it going?
Exactly.
But when you look at this front three, did you see what you wanted to see from them? What more did you want if you didn't?
Well, I think what I look at is the sophistication coming in, because like against Uzbekistan, you expect to see a ton of opportunities on goal. And then when you look at like the caliber around the world outside of that, you might not get that many opportunities. So the final pass, the finishing of that are still things that we're gonna always be a work in progress, especially when you have a young team. And I like that Nate Santee, I think it is, in the comments, did say about the final pass, because that was going to be my next point on all of this, is regardless of how dynamic they were, that final pass was missing early on in the game. However, even though it was missing, it did put Uzbekistan under a ton of pressure that resulted in a lot of set pieces. And where the first goal come from, Andi Sullivan off a set piece. So there's so many opportunities here for the U.S. I think to answer your question specifically, it would be a little bit more sophistication, picking out the player, finding that extra pass in balance with wanting to attack with some pace, right? Because that is a tough thing. If you're trying to put teams under pressure, you want to score early, you want to get them on their back heels, it's a fine line between finding the most perfect pass. But that does come down to partnerships that we've talked about, whether it's the outside the winger or the outside back or the central midfielders too, right? So, but a ton of set pieces, and it did result in a couple early goals for the U.S. from set pieces.
Yes, that's the opening goal. That's how it happened. They had so many chances on set pieces, corner kicks mainly. Not a lot of fouls happening throughout this match in favor of the United States, but a lot of corner kick set pieces, which is something that this team has focused on. And when you looked at this starting lineup, the aerial presence not necessarily there for set piece opportunities. So Lindsey Horan probably being the player to win the most balls out of the air. I think Alana Cook was making those near every single time on the corner kick, something that she does for club in OL Reign. But it's a different look when we have a United States team getting so many corner kick opportunities and not being the most threatening team in the air on those. So we talked about the front three a little bit, and you just touched on it, Lori, those vertical lines and playing in that type of partnership. Head coach Vlatko Andonovski touched on those lines. If the outside backs in Kelly O'Hara can connect with the midfield in Horan and Rose Lavelle, and then up front with Sophia Smith, those are partnerships that Andonovski was looking for in this match. And preview of these, one of the things you touched on that you wanted to see is how those vertical lines and those vertical channels looked between a Sophia Smith and a Kelly O'Hara in behind her, and an Emily Fox on the left side with a Mallory Pugh up front. And were they stacked together, or were they creating more separation, which allowed for different channels and different angles in behind them? And then actually, we saw them switch, Pugh and Smith switching up top. I like to see that versatility as well. I think that between O'Hara and Smith, there was a little bit more cohesion than there was between Emily Fox and Pugh on the left side of the flank, especially in that first half. But did you notice those lines of telling where the space was going to be, especially opening up the space in the midfield for the U.S.?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I thought it was a good game for the U.S. overall. And when we talk about those partnerships that you just mentioned on, yes, a lot more of the play. I would like to see a bit of a heat map of what it looked like in terms, because the right hand side definitely had the majority of the possession throughout that first half. To your point, so I think we typically saw Smith getting isolated, taking on 1v1, earning a lot of those set pieces or corner kicks. But one of the, and slightly different the way that Kelly O'Hara and Emily Fox play. I mean, Emily Fox, we saw at one point in time, was on that front line that opened up space to lead to one of the goals. So, it looks a little bit different. However, I still think, it's kind of a predictable situation in the fact that, this game worked to the advantage of the US with how much space there was.
Right.
I think when we typically have questions about the partnerships and what it looks like is when there isn't as much space, right? We saw a Rose Lavelle who was on the right side with a Kelly O'Hara and Sophia Smith. She'll float out wide and pick up the ball quite wide. However, when you do have a team that is going to sit back, what does that look like? Is Kelly O'Hara going, or is she going to pinch in? Is Sophia Smith going to pinch in? Because then that's when the questions start to be asked about the positioning of all the players, because is Rose occupying space of Sophia Smith or Kelly O'Hara? That's easy to defend. However, those questions weren't really asked in this game because of how Uzbekistan set up defensively. So that's where I question about going forward on tomorrow night's game. What does that look like? Because if they do sit back, then we are going to have to. And I think that's something we will see in World Cup qualifiers. Teams aren't just going to necessarily all park the bus, right? But they will sit back. You're qualifying for a World Cup. You're doing whatever you can. Looks very different than an international friendly, right? At least so. I think that those are the questions I have still that weren't completely answered in this game, but there was some good positional play. I think good fluidity through periods of this game.
So one thing I really want to chat about is the goal for Uzbekistan. This was 7-0 game happening in the 70th minute or so. Uzbekistan wins a corner kick and they get on the board 7-1. It ends the United States 2-year home shutout streak. This was in on Alyssa Nair, so no clean sheet for her in this match. After the game, Vlatko Andonovski in his media availability said that he was happy that this happened. He wanted this goal to happen heading into World Cup qualifiers. This is what they needed. It's almost a reset button for this team. And then how do you respond after the goal? When a team, I mean, there's so many different parts of this that I want to pick apart. The corner kick, how it happened, the defending of the set pieces for the United States to score so many goals on set pieces and then to concede one on a set piece as well. Also, being up 7 goals, you lose your focus a little bit. You lose your intensity. It's not get the ball and go to goal every single time. Your mindset changes a little, especially when you have a lot of younger players in the mix. Watching this game and seeing the goal, what was your initial reaction to see that? What were your thoughts about this goal?
I think my initial reactions are that's soccer and there's fine margins, right? And it was, I thought, a hell of a free kick, like a corner kick, right? I thought it was a great ball served in that was flicked on. And then I'll ultimately, as we know, put away. However, I think that's those are the more interesting questions to me. And this is the smallest little piece of the puzzle. However, when you think, and we were talking off air before this about all the conversation around the veteran players and that kind of stuff. However, if you spin it, these things are going to happen in World Cup qualifying, right? Because that is the next most important. Yes, you have the June window, but the next most important is World Cup qualifying, and it's challenging. It is challenging. Right. It's going to be hot. There's going to be a lot of games, and there has to be a couple of voices that are saying it does not matter like what the score is, whatever, it's the finest little details. And so I'm more curious about who is that vocal voice right now. Of course, you have Alyssa Nair, right? But and Abby Dahlkemper, who would be, and Kelly O'Hara, who is the captain. Those three you would assume would be the voice. But somebody has to be, whatever it takes, we do not get scored on. And those are just kind of like the moments in the game that you can't have lapses, because let's just say it's not 7-0, right? Which is possible. You have
Right.
a young team, a team maybe that sits back, the team starting to get frustrated, can't score goals like we saw in the first 25 minutes. It's not going your way. And then what? You concede a corner and they score. So the game is made up of these small little moments. And I like Vlatko's response. It doesn't surprise me at all. And I think the players in general will be fired up. And it's also a great learning experience for these, because I talk about this a lot and I mean it so seriously. The difference between club and international play, those are the moments, because regardless of who you're playing against, they will punish you. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen in club. It's just different. And it is more on the line when you're talking about qualifying or winning a gold medal or whatever, right? And so you have to be ready. And that's why these games are so invaluable for these young players and teachable moments for them as well.
Huge. These moments are huge because we got to see how the United States team reacted when this goal went in and how they responded after it happened. Even if you rewatch this match, 10 minutes leading up to that 70-minute goal from Uzbekistan, there was a shift. Even if you look 5 minutes before that goal, because that's when Uzbekistan really was putting a lot of pressure on the United States backline. I mean, more pressure than they had throughout the entirety of the game. And they continued to be patient and work the ball down the field. And they had a set piece opportunity, a free kick on the corner of the 18. And then the United States can't clear it ultimately, and it ends up being a corner kick, and that's where the goal ultimately comes from. But so it's all these little learning moments, and yes, it's just one small moment in a game, but that's a moment that an opponent found a crack in the United States defensive abilities on that set piece, and it was a great goal. It was a great goal. It was really good ball played in, and really good positioning by the Uzbekistan forward to knee this right into the top of the net. Essentially, she kneed it directly up. Because of that, it exposes a little bit of organization that needs to maybe change on corner kicks. And having Alyssa Nair in goal, and it wasn't someone like an Aubrey Kingsbury or Bella Bigsby that have 0 caps. This was her 80th cap. And I think that reflects a little bit on the organization of that back line. But one thing it does also reflect on is that center back pairing that we have in that back line. And this is something that off air we had said we really want to talk about. And I'm moving it up to right now in this conversation, because looking at the center backs for the United States, we had starting in this match, it was Abby Dahlkemper and Alana Cook. Abby Dahlkemper has been a mainstay in that back line. She's played alongside Becky Sauerbrunn for a number of matches, and Alana Cook has worked her way into that back line as well. Oftentimes we saw Alana Cook playing alongside Tierna Davidson, who not called into this camp, is out injured with a knee injury. And there's a number of question marks across this back line, but specifically looking at the center back pairing between Abby Dahlkemper and Alana Cook. Naomi Girma also called into this camp that I think we could see coming up tomorrow on Tuesday for their match, but no Becky Sauerbrunn, no Tierna Davidson, Crystal Dunn also not called in along this back line. So between Dahlkemper and Alana Cook, they weren't tested that frequently and that consistently throughout this first match for the United States. But did you like that pairing between those two? What did you see from those two?
Yeah, I do. I mean, you said it. There wasn't a lot for them to do defensively, let's say, right? But I think we all know essentially what Abby Dahlkemper can do, right? She's played many games there, particularly with Becky Sauerbrunn. But I was and have been really impressed with Alana Cook. I think with OL Reign, her continue to have the consistency back there. We saw her score a goal a few weeks back against Angel City, a great goal, heading a header. And then her ability to play out. There's a simplicity, and I don't mean that in a negative way. In fact, I mean that in such a praise. There's a simplicity on how she wants to play, on finding interior passes into our midfielders, but also having the range. And then I think just next level when it came to her to assist, obviously with the first goal with Andi Sullivan, and then when Jealin Howell, of just being able to knock it back down, not trying to do too much, not trying to score from difficult angles herself, just knocking it back into the mix. And that can be overstated in the fact that those, much like we were talking about for the Uzbekistan goal, that there's just such a simplicity into understanding who's going to have a better opportunity. And I think they're a fantastic assist. So when you think about a modern day center back, Alana Cook is 100% in that conversation, in my opinion, in terms of being able to set play that we talk about, like a number 6 does, a holding midfielder,
Right.
but then also being able to join into the attack and then when you think about set pieces and not having, the biggest of players in terms of the aerial battle, Alana Cook is 100% in that conversation in terms of one of the better ones, if not one of the best on this national team currently. So in terms of the partnership, not much testing, but who I wanted to see in this first game, and I thought they did well.
Yeah, you did want to see Abby Dahlkemper and Alana Cook.
I might switch now that I think about it, Lisa. I have Dahlkemper and Girma for the next match because of their San Diego.
Oh, yeah?
But I'm kind of thinking I scratched out Dahlkemper. I enjoy Dahlkemper back there, but I actually would like to see Cook and Girma because I would like to see Cook with somebody that maybe has a little bit less experience than her and see how she steps up in that role.
Yes, I think that's a good kind of shift to make. And we are going to talk about what we want to see on Tuesday from the United States team. But when you look at Abby Dahlkemper specifically as a player, this is a player that has had some inconsistencies at the center back role for club, for country exclusively. When you look at her Olympics run in Tokyo, there were some question marks in the decisions that she was making and balls that she was playing. And of course, going next to someone like Becky Sauerbrunn, who is a tremendous defender in Sauerbrunn. She is so good at 1v1 defending. She's even good out of the air with aerial balls, even though she's not the tallest player on the pitch. And she's so good with her vision and breaking lines with her passes. She has a really good decision-making in Becky Sauerbrunn. Now, when you look at a player like Abby Dahlkemper, she really needs to step up and be that veteran without Sauerbrunn here. Be that player that can break lines, can dribble with the ball, can be really smart decision-making when she gets the ball, and also help reset, as you mentioned, in the attack for this team when they are playing against a team in a lower back. Can Dahlkemper receive the ball from one side, spring it out? Can she organize a little bit quicker in that back line? When you look at Abby Dahlkemper specifically, do you think there's a difference when she plays along Fox that we saw for most of this first match, but then Fox got subbed out, Huerta came in, and Kelly O'Hara switched to the left side? Do you see a difference between Dahlkemper playing alongside Fox or O'Hara in that back line?
Well, I don't know, because I think typically we see Dahlkemper on the right side, right? And we saw Cook on the right side. So I think it's that's more the question mark, not really who she's playing against or with. It'd be more how she's comfortable, because we also see her with San Diego Wave with on the right side with Girma on the left in that center back position. So I'm curious, because that does change, right? That change how you play, the terms of your angles, how you open up. And there's no doubt, I wouldn't say that I have any question marks. I'd be more curious about Dahlkemper's state of mind right now. I mean, she's battled through some injuries. Went from North Carolina, was in Man City last year, right? Then went to Houston for a little bit, then got, I think it was the back injury leading into this season, and now getting back into the mix. So my question's more with Dahlkemper, not her capabilities. The question is her capabilities in terms of leading, as you mentioned, with somebody who has less experience. So what does this season look like with her and Girma consistently, right? And then with the national team with Cook, especially with Tierna being out and Becky still making her way back. So that would be the question. And then just also where she is a little bit mentally wise, finding her form again, because I'm not quite sure she is. It's not that she's not 100%. It's just totally in that flow of 100% in the games, I guess. Just getting games under her belt is more of my question.
Yeah, I think those are all really valid points, and having depth at the back line for Vlatko Andonovski, but specifically at that center back position, it's difficult to do when you're playing against opponents that aren't necessarily attacking you that much. You're not being tested that consistently across the back line in order to get depth in those positions. We are seeing Girma being called into this camp. I think that's a huge step in the right direction for Vlatko Andonovski to get her experience even in the camp, in training, to be alongside Dahlkemper and Cook. It's difficult to have them be so assessed in these matches just because there isn't a lot of pressure coming at that back line. So we talked about the back line. We talked about the front three. I really want to dive into the sixth position that we have. We're going to talk about Andi Sullivan, Jealin, Howell, and that defensive midfield, as well as what we want to see on Tuesday from the United States in their second match against Uzbekistan. We'll be right back after this quick break.
They call me Tech God Willy Wonka. Up to my gobstoppers in secrets. And it's all true.
I'm talking to someone from another planet.
Do you know what this is? Do you know what this means?
Go. Take him. Now.
The world's been asking, who am I?
Welcome back to the United States Women's National Team Hour. We are diving into the first match for the U.S. against Uzbekistan, what we saw from player rotation. And now I want to look at this midfield, dive into what we saw. The starting three in the midfield for Vlatko Andonovski in this first match was Rose Lavelle, Lindsey Horan, and Andi Sullivan. Andi Sullivan sitting in that sixth position, a player that you had starting, Lori, I had starting in that midfield. We spoke with former national team goalkeeper Jill Loyden. She also had Sullivan starting in that defensive midfield position. So it's no surprise, that Andi Sullivan got the start in that role. But Lori, you really wanted to see what Andi Sullivan could bring, how she could be that pivot player for this team and really control the midfield. Now, she was paired up with Lindsey Horan and Rose Lavelle, two players that also have a lot of experience in the midfield for their country. But from Andi Sullivan and that midfield unit, what did you see from them?
Yeah, well, this is my favorite, I think, out of all of the conversations right now around this team. This is my favorite one because I think this position is the most wide open, and it's why we've talked about it. And knowing how Andi Sullivan plays and what she's capable of, I thought it was a good performance. I think it was a really good goal. Obviously, she can also be a threat on set pieces, whether it's off the initial ball or just, rerouting her run and framing the goal like she did off the Alana Cook assist. However, I still, maybe this is me being naive and really kind of like envisioning how I would like to see some of the play from the US, but I'm still wanting to see somebody that really kind of wants to take the game and the team in their own hands in that position in terms of like, all right, get the ball off the back line, turn, just link play, whether it's like shorter passes, get it back, switch the point, because I still feel like there's other ways that this U.S. can attack, especially when we see different opponents throw at them. So I thought it was a really solid performance by Andi, and I still think that there is another level. One thing that I think is interesting, and we mentioned it last week, also is not necessarily changing the formation, because I don't really see Vlatko doing that, at least right now. But it was mentioned with Ali and JP on the broadcast about, maybe playing with two holding sixes. I think that's interesting. I don't necessarily, I think that you can do that now, right? With the players, it requires a little bit of nuance and a shifting of players' roles. So, I was thinking about it in terms of, who
would you want to see in
that
pit?
Because the two players that we think in that position right now are Jealin, Howell, and Andi Sullivan. And the only reason, I don't necessarily know if I would play them together. However, the only reason why I would is because I personally think that Andi is more of a true number 8, a box-to-box in between, because she has a lot of attacking abilities and a final pass that is not showcased a ton.
Right.
We see it some, but not all the time with the Washington Spirit, and that's just her role, right? It's just a little bit of a different role. They utilize her and need her positional and expertise in different ways. However, we have seen her join the attack, and there's a final pass that she has. She has the ability to shoot from distance. So I'm not sure I'd play those two, but listen, in a perfect world, I would love to see Sam Ewis. And I said it before about like a 2019 World Cup Sam Ewis. Yes, I understand that there's like a different level, she's had some injuries and stuff. But she did play that number 8, and it would just require her to drop back and have more specific defensive responsibility next to, like, let's say, an Andi. Because I do think Andi is further along than Jealin Howell right now. That's not taking away from Howell's abilities. I think they're very different players. And I think Jealin Howell is still getting used to, I mean, she's rookie, right? Rookie in the league, minimal caps with the national team. And to play in that lone role is a big responsibility. So that's why we're having the conversation, right? Because Julie Ertz occupied it in a way that you don't see a lot of players occupy it, right? She was going to, let's just say I didn't want to go against her. I was like, you're going to take my legs. So no, thank you. However, Andi Sullivan brings something different than Julie Ertz, but that does require some different positional play and understanding amongst other players. And
exactly,
I know
it does.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, Lori, continue.
Okay.
Go
I was
on.
going to say,
Your
because I think about this a lot when we missed the number 6 a lot, right? Which was against Sweden in the Olympics, and Lindsey Horan had to play in that position, and Aslani from Sweden did a really good job. So then who are you playing? Because we know that Rose is like one of the best dribblers out of the midfield in the world, but that looks like, do you play her in a game of that when Sweden's set up that way? Because you need somebody else that's going to drop back and help set play, help give cover to the back line. So I don't necessarily think it's a difference in the way that you set up. But I think it does require some different specific roles for players, I should say.
It does. And not having Sam Mewis in the midfield and not being called into this camp, well, called in initially, but dealing with some injuries, so not being present for this camp and these matches, it changes the way the midfield looks. And now that Vlahonovsky is having Katerina Macario playing higher in that front line, which I think she should stay there. She does a tremendous job in that front line, but it changes things in the midfield when we look at the 3 that he has. And whether it's a pivot, a double pivot with 2 6s in the back, we've seen Lindsey Horan play that role. I like her much higher up the field. She's not as effective when she's playing that 6 role, as you just mentioned, versus Sweden. It was lacking. There was a big gaping hole there when she was playing that role. But I agree. I don't think Andi Sullivan has taken that position and said, it's mine, no one take it from me, like a little toddler with a toy. That's what I want her to do. Solidify herself so well in that role that when Julie Ertz decides she wants to come back after her pregnancy, that it's a battle between those two. Because right now, if Julie Ertz were to come back for the June camp, it would be Julie Ertz's role. Just, of course, depending on her health and her status, and even if she wants to come back. But Andi Sullivan hasn't necessarily taken ownership of that 6 role. When you look at Jealin Howell got the second half. So Andi Sullivan and Howell split in that first game, 45 minutes each apiece. Both actually scored a goal in this match. Jealin Howell's first senior team goal. So that was really exciting for her. You could just see the joy on her face. But another player that wasn't called into this, that actually TJ Trex, who's joining our chat again this time, mentioned Morgan Gautreau, a player that doesn't necessarily play that defensive role as well. She does push a little bit higher, but could we see potentially her being called back in? Even looking at the June camps, of course, this is a long ways away, but when you focus in on that midfield unit and the trio in that middle of the field for the United States, and specifically looking at the 6 role, Andi Sullivan, Morgan Gautreau in that pivot position, like that could be different. Could we see, I know you mentioned Vlahonovsky, most likely not switch-ins, but 3 in the back, dropping Andi Sullivan even a little deeper, or even Jealin Howell trying to be that 3 center back, then allowing the outside backs to get forward so much more of a 3-5 in that back line and midfield. Are these possible options? Have you thought about this at all? I know that it's most likely unlikely, but it's fun to chat about.
Listen, I think that the beauty of the league continuing to grow and continuing to evolve is that somebody like Morgan Gautreau's career is revitalized, right? We saw her an important role in the 2015 World Cup and then kind of fall off the scene and get herself healthy again. I mean, battling through a little bit the early stages of this this Challenge Cup, but now back. And I think that's one of the reasons why she wasn't called in. I think if she was playing consistently,
Right.
she has been doing really well for Chicago. And one of the reasons why I felt like they made it to the final, right, of last year's the NWSL championship. It all comes down to performances. So all of these players have the ability. Morgan Gautrat, for instance, has the experience. It just depends on how you're performing, staying healthy. And I think a lot of that will be some of those decisions will be made for Vlatko, right? Because the games in the challenge, in the NWSL are challenging, and we've already seen a few players who are important to this team out. Lynn Williams, Sam Mewis right now. And the countless other ones, Tierna Davidson, and all the other players, veterans that we're seeing come back. But yes, I think that it is wide open, right, for a lot of these positions in some ways. It's just going to be about performance and consistency with the club, especially with this U.S. team. And I think I mentioned it last time, at least, because what is interesting about this and why we're able to have these conversations is because with how pay is being structured now, and it not overseeing with U.S. soccer, and gone really are the days where you go in like what seemed like 3 months before like a World Cup, right? So the way that Vlatko to see how these players are performing is through their club. It's just you don't have as much time anymore, and it's typical with like what's been the deal around the world on both the men's and women's sides. So you have to be able to play with whoever. You have to be able to adapt to the different systems, but mostly perform, which is a lot. I mean, when it comes down to it, that's what you get paid for, but it is to be consistent for 11 months.
It's kind of your job. That's what you're getting paid for. But seeing the rotation in the NWSL too, the 2021 off season before this 2022 Challenge Cup started, there was so much player movement, which I think Vlatko Andonovski was a little bit excited about because it tests how Kristie Mewis is now going to play at Gotham, not at Houston anymore, around players that she is really comfortable with, but now going to Gotham and playing with a new rotation of players, a different style of play in that midfield. I want to stick with this midfield unit a little bit more because we saw player rotation throughout this match. Of course, Jealin Howell coming in at the midfield, also Kristie Mewis checking in for Lindsey Horan, that then stayed on with Rose Lavelle. These different player rotations is definitely something I wanted to see. Ultimately, Ashley Sanchez then does come on for Rose Lavelle, but throughout this 90 minutes, there was different player rotation, but the midfield unit being substituted first in this match. And having Howell and Mewis coming in, was that what you were expecting to see at the 45 minute at the halftime mark with those rotations starting in the midfield?
Well, I have to admit that I was a little bit surprised that Howell did come in at the 45th minute for Andi. I just expected a little bit, at least maybe the 60-minute mark, but I think that proves and speaks to exactly what we're talking about, that position being wide open. And then I do believe, and this hasn't been confirmed, it's just my own opinion, but or thoughts.
We love it.
But I think that Lindsey Horan is probably battling still a little bit of a knee injury. We've seen that it wrapped, right? And so I think it was managing of minutes for Lindsey Horan, and hoping that they'll get time for her in this next game as well. So I think that was the reason behind that. However, I mean, even though the 6 position doesn't seem like there's like a ton of depth right there, or it's still wide open, I mean, when you look at the attacking midfield positions, like take your pick. Like, I mean, I was hoping for this first game, it was the Horan, Sullivan, and Sanchez combination. And then for the second game, I'm still hoping that Sullivan will get the start because I would like to see her in these back-to-back games. And then I had Mewis and Lavelle. But since we did see Lavelle, I would be curious now to see, I would swap maybe Rose in for Sanchez and get Sanchez some more minutes from the beginning. And then because, a lot of times with Kristie Mewis, one of the reasons why she got herself back, listen, Kristie Mewis used to come in with national team camps when I was playing. Like she was like, I want to say 13. She wasn't, but she might as well have been. And
you're yourself, Lori, you are not that old. You're not that far removed. I mean, but the point is,
Kristie Mewis, they think I'm old.
Kristie Mewis has been in these camps for forever,
Yeah.
for a long
Yeah.
time. And
And
then she
then
wasn't. There was a 5-year hiatus where she wasn't called in, dealing with injury, kind of getting back into form.
Exactly. And the reason why she's back in is because she was dominant with Houston, right? She was such an impact player for them. And I personally think Christy Mewis is best in more of that 8 role as well. I mean, she can drop deep and play balls over the top. We saw a few of those in this game with Uzbekistan, and she did it quite a bit in the midfield for Houston Dash when she was playing at her best. Now, I think, switching teams with Gotham and her coming through a few different injuries early on too in the Challenge Cup, just working her way back into more consistent playing time. Can she continue to produce that way? But I have her in that starting lineup tomorrow along with Sanchez and Sullivan, because I do think she can be that two-way player that we've talked about, which could drop a little bit deeper and not necessarily sit next to Sullivan, but play off of her and play some different types of balls from a deeper position that then allows Sanchez to have more of that little combination play with Macario and them being a little bit more interchange. So that's what I would like to see. I think that's when I think about balance in the midfield. I think those 3 would be interesting. So
I agree. I want to see Sanchez in there with Rose too. I want to see what that can provide and what that can do.
I like that shout. I think that's interesting. I haven't really thought about that. But goodness, that's
They're
the last thing you would
similar.
want, Lise. People running at that back, the 2 of them running at the back line.
And that's the last thing that opponents would want. I think it would expose the midfield a lot. So, but against a team like Uzbekistan that isn't causing that much of a threat in the midfield, they didn't dominate the midfield against the United States. That could be pretty fun, very dangerous. But then you also have to have that conversation with the front line between, say it is Smith, Pugh, and Macario again up front, how they're going to react when you have Lavelle and Sanchez just streaking down and it's really 5 in that front line. We might almost lose midfield in that sense.
Yeah. And it also depends on too, I think, yes, great point about how the opponent is set up. And then also, because that's what makes Rose so special, right? Is where she's able to pick up the ball and start running at the opposition. So I'm curious. I like that. I like that combination a lot. And it also just depends on how you structure the defense behind, so that, if you're a pressing team like the United States and the ball is turned over, then who's stepping in? Is that a Kelly O'Hare? Is that Emily Fox sitting it? So there's so many ways that you can solve that. And it just depends on what parts of the field that you want to give away defensively, if that is the case, and it does turn over and you're exposed in some. It just depends. So
exactly.
Yikes.
And Emily Grace Resser and Christopher Meister, they're calling us out. They're saying that Sanchez Rose moving up the central channel would be terrifying. Yes.
I would fall. If I was a defender, I would just lay down and hope that something would happen.
Okay, fine. You win. Lori, looking at the second match for the United States against Uzbekistan, they play tomorrow, Tuesday, April 12th in Philadelphia at Subaru Park. You've given us hints and little tastes of what you want to see in the starting lineup, but does it change from what you initially gave us last week? What 11 do you want to see get the start tomorrow?
Well, I definitely want to see Kingsbury, Aubrey Kingsbury. I think it's important. One, she's been very good with the Spirit consistently over the years. And I think it would be vital for the U.S. to get her at least a game, because what happens if Nair goes down, right? You don't have a ton of experience in that position, and it's important to get it in these games that quote unquote don't matter as much. So I'd still like to see Kingsbury. I would still like to see Huerta. I have her in there. I already mentioned about Dahlkemper and swapping Dahlkemper out for Cook Gurma potentially. And when I think I had Dorsey in there, I still would like to see Imani Dorsey. She's been called in. Let's give some of these players some chances, right? There's so many games that are happening right now, and thinking about managing players. Some will go back and there'll be 2 games, like OL Reign specifically has a Thursday, Sunday game this coming week. So it's about managing some of those minutes. We talked about the midfield, Sullivan, Christy Mewis, and Sanchez I'm going with. So I did switch out Rose in that one because we saw Rose start. I do have a full front line switch. I kind of like that. And I had that last week too of Rodman on the left, Hatch and Purse. I'm sticking with it. I do not think that Vlatko was going to go with a full line change up top. I think he'll ride the wave of those players doing well and giving them a another go, and then maybe getting some of those players in later in the game for sure. But yeah, I'm still sticking by a Rodman, Hatch, and Purse. I would love to see full line swap. See how they do. I mean, build depth where you can. See how these players. Because the one thing, Lise, too, I think is important too. When you have these young players, and I'm sure I've said this before. But like honestly, getting these players minutes and like experience and confidence at that level is huge. Like it is like just the competition level. If anybody can ever go, if practices open up again and you can go to like open training sessions with the national team, it is a whole nother level. It is like wild. And so to be able to take that back to your club team is massive for these young players' confidence, and then for their club teams. And then that's what you want, because that's ultimately where they're developing and playing the most.
So your front three, I'm sorry, you want to see Rodman, Hatch, and Purse?
Yeah. I'm like, bring it on. I like that.
I love that. I'm not sure. I think we could see a line swap from Vlatko Andonovski, especially because his front line got a lot of time in this first match. The front line, Hatch did come on for Macario, and Margaret Purse did come on for Sophia Smith. So Mal Pugh getting a full 90 in that first match. I don't think we'll see her get a full 90 again. So I don't see Pugh starting in this second match for the United States against Uzbekistan on Tuesday. I want to see Rodman get minutes, right? She's been called in. She didn't get time in that last game. Another player you mentioned, Dorsey and Naomi Girma, and then the goalkeepers in Kingsbury and Bella Bigby not getting any time in the last match. Of course, there's only so many rotations that can happen and player substitutions, but you're calling these players into the camp. If it's not for an injury, let's get them minutes. Let's see what they can do. And we don't know the status of that right now based on the camp over the last week and the players' health and where they are based on that. I do want to see Girma in the back line. I would like to see her alongside Dahlkemper, and then maybe a rotation in with Alana Cook and see kind of how Girma does. But I want to see Dahlkemper and Girma in that back line. I don't think we'll see Kelly O'Hara get a full 90 anymore. I do think she'll play and get minutes in that back line, but I agree. I want to see Huerta in that back line. I would like Dorsey to get minutes as well. I don't think Dorsey will get a start in the back line, though. I want Jealin Howell to get the start in the midfield. I do. I think that it can change things. And for you, Lori, as a player that has been with this national team and played professionally, is there a different mindset or different tactics as a player that starts versus comes in off the bench? Are there benefits to seeing Howell get the start, Girma get the start, Hatch get the start up top as players who have typically come in off the bench? Is there a big difference?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, starting, well, it's an honor to get the start, but also, you're working your way into the game as the game is getting set up and evolving. So sometimes I think starting the game is easier, depending on the opponent and what is happening and all the extracurriculars outside of just the game, right? So, but yeah, it is a different mindset, and I think coming off the bench, whether it's straight from halftime or into the game, there's a level of like how do you get your first touch under your belt and build confidence within that. And it is important too to know that like this looks very different, because not only are you performing in terms of like the overarching as a US team and like upholding what the history of this team in terms of winning and like the attacking prowess that it has, but you're vying for spots. And so you're making a statement for your individual self. So going out there and like doing what you can and performing what makes you special is important. So yeah, I mean, listen, if Howell gets the start, I'll be really interested too in how she, because we've seen her come off the bench, right? A lot with the US.
Yes.
We're not a lot, but in her appearances. So how does she manage that? And can she be that player that kind of sets the tone for the team and links up? We'll see. I don't personally see her as that type of player of getting it off the back line and moving the ball. Doesn't mean she can't.
So if Howell does get the start, does that send a message to Andi Sullivan? Like, hey, this position is open and up for grabs right now.
Like, listen, I think there's probably always messages and then there's not, I don't see Vlatko as the type of coach that's playing like mind games. I think he is constantly evaluating. And I think that he looking at this roster and these players consistently getting called in since there has been the statement from him being like, these older players are going to get rested and I need to see them perform because I need to get more depth within this team. That's been the message, right? And so I think just depends. I don't see Howell starting this one. Could be wrong. I can't wait till I see you tomorrow at the stadium and we both be like, listen, we need to have some sort of bet. But either way, I'll be excited. I think it just gives you a different look, the team a different look.
It does. It does. I'm not sure if we'll see Howell start either. I agree with that. I think Andi Sullivan has earned that starting role, and I think that she deserves it. I'd love to hear you say that Blackwanadopsy doesn't play mind games, or at least you hope he doesn't, because that is just the worst.
Yeah, I don't see that. I haven't heard that. I don't see that.
I don't see that happening either. So we've talked all about this, and we even touched on Uzbekistan and how they came out playing a little bit of a higher line. What do you foresee Uzbekistan doing tomorrow after losing 9-1? They did get on the board in a set piece opportunity in the 70th minute in the first match for against the United States. But do you see Uzbekistan sitting back a little bit more, trying to be more defensive, or exposing themselves a little bit, playing a higher line, especially if there is a different front three? It's not the quick getting behind of Pugh and Smith that we saw on Saturday. What are you expecting from Uzbekistan?
That's curious because I don't know a lot about their history, right?
Yes.
To be quite frank. However, I think that they actually might try to play a little bit. I ultimately think, though, them continuing to gain experience, one thing that we have known to be true with some of these federations that are just starting to come onto the scene even more, is that this quick turnaround will be a lot, right? So by default, they might have to sit back, and because of just depending on how deep their team is, right, and how much turnover they show in their starting lineup. But I do think that they will be pinned back, and I think just the quick turnaround will force them to be a bit more defensive and not be able to necessarily step out into that more of attacking shape that we saw.
Yes, and then that asks more questions of Andi Sullivan if she's playing in that 6 role to be the one that shifts the ball from side to side, and something that we were asking of her in this first match that didn't necessarily require that much of, but we also didn't see that much of it from Andi Sullivan in that first match, to be that player to really control the pace of the play and switch the ball from side to side and join in the attack, but also use the ball at her feet as a reset opportunity. One thing, when Jealin Howell did come in the second half, we saw her receiving the ball, and she was oftentimes looking to play it longer than Andi Sullivan, who often looks to connect on short range passes. And that's a difference between those two types of players in that 6 role, because that I love talking about that defensive midfield role and what we can see from the different personnel, and also in the center backs. We are going to have to get a little bet going about something for this U.S. team tomorrow as they play their second friendly in Philadelphia, because we'll both be there. So if anyone's there, come try to say hi to us. Let us know. This is fantastic. Before we go, we only have a few minutes left. I want to look at our chat for a second, because Christopher Meister, we've called you out before. You ask a great question here to Lori. You say, hey, Lori, can you talk about when Vlatko says his attacking 5 versus 6? And he mentions this in some of his post-game media about whether the United States is attacking with 5 or 6. This is a little formational soccer knowledge that Lori has, so we get to tap into it. Lori, 5 versus 6. Can you explain this for Christopher?
Yeah. Oh, what is it? What does it mean? Like, who are the front 5 or who are 6 when? Yeah. So if the way that I understand it would be the typical front 5 that you would think, right, which would be the front 3 and then the 2 attacking mids. I mean, that's pretty apparent. But however, sometimes that could also be the front 3, one of the attacking mids, and also the near or far-sided, depending on how the attack is building up, outside back, right? And then, so typically it would be the front three, one or two, if not both of the, one or two of the attacking mids, and then the weak or far-sided outside back.
Outside back. Yes.
So, yeah,
I
depending.
agree. I'm not sure the exact quote that Christopher is referring to, but those are the front five versus the front six. And I think in different scenarios, Andonovski wants to see the 5 versus the 6. We'll see what we have tomorrow. But thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today. Lori, final thoughts from you as we do this. We'll come up with our bet later, but final thoughts.
Yeah, we'll come up with our bet. And no, I mean, I think it'll be interesting. And one last thing, I should say yes. I said no. Now that you said it, though, a second ago about, I don't know if there's going to be a front line change, because maybe Vlatko Andonovski is anticipating that Uzbekistan could be sitting back. So what does it look like with that similar starting lineup, and how do they deal with that? Is my final thought. We'll see.
Final thought. We'll see who Vlatko Andonovski lines up in his 11, but mainly that front three we want to see. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us. If you like this video and you dropped your social media handle in the chat without the @ symbol, look out for a DM from us. You could be our Paramount Plus subscription winner. Follow us on Twitter @ Attacking Third for more. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and anywhere that you listen to your podcast. You can subscribe to us on YouTube to catch our interviews and get alerts for when we go live. YouTube.com/Attacking Third. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We'll be back Monday for another U.S. Women's National Team Hour. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day, everyone.